Hi, this is Stephanie Ruhle. Can y'all hear me?
I can.
All right. John, thank you so much. I am so honored to be speaking to you tonight. I'm so honored to be here. I feel like, especially in the last 6 weeks, me personally, and so much of what we're covering around Corona, a huge focus and concern is around education. And while a lot of people are thinking about education for their own kids, it's really, really easy to forget, for all of us who care so much about income inequality and social disparities, what COVID is doing in terms of education and the millions of kids in this country, what this is doing to them, how much they are losing. I'm honored that you're joining us tonight. I thank you so much for your time, especially given how busy you are. I think we're ready to get started. So I want to just get right into it. And I actually just, before we get into COVID and students, I'd love for you to just talk a bit about yourself, John. How did this become your career path? How did this become your life's work?
Great. Well, thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for joining me for this conversation. I'm excited to talk with you tonight. I come to this work really driven by my own experiences as a student. I grew up in New York City, grew up in Brooklyn. Both my parents were New York City public school educators, so I heard about school all the time at the dinner table. But they couldn't have known the difference that school would ultimately make in my life. Both of them passed away when I was a kid. My mom passed away when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. The period after my mom passed, while I was living with my dad had undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So home was this environment that was scary and unpredictable and incredibly difficult and lonely. But the thing that saved me was school. I had a series of just amazing New York City public school teachers who made school safe, compelling, engaging, nurturing. I had a teacher in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, Alan Osterweil. I still am in touch with him. He saved my life. I mean, in his classroom, I remember the things we did like it was yesterday. Read the New York Times every day. We did productions of Alice in Wonderland and Midsummer Night's Dream in his class. And so that saved me. And when I was figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, I wanted to try to do for other kids what teachers did for me. And that's driven me from being a teacher to principal to policy, always the same goal, try to help kids the way teachers help me.
Then tell us a bit about EdTrust.
Sure. So at the end of the administration, the question for me, was where could I continue to work on education opportunity, particularly for low-income students and students of color. And the Education Trust has had a mission for 25 years of fighting for low-income students and students of color. We do a mix of research and advocacy. We do work at the federal level and the state level. And, what I love about it is I get to be sort of unabashed about the advocacy. It is very clear when we show up at an event, when we publish a report, it is to draw attention to the equity gaps that we have and the reality that as a country, we give the least to the students who need the most. Low-income students, students of color get less access to quality early childhood education, less access to the strongest teachers, less access to resources, less access to counselors, less access to all the things we know matter. And that's the fight that we're in, to make sure that we give every kid in American society a shot, regardless of race, regardless of zip code, regardless of their family's immigration status. Every kid deserves an opportunity.
Then can you explain the disconnect, why there's not more broad-based support in terms of your advocacy for all of the people and the organizations and the businesses that talk about how much they care about income inequality and opportunity inequality? It's very, very clear, based on what you just laid out in very basic terms, that if you want to address any of these issues, it starts with education. Why can't we get there? Why can't we get more people to see that? Even on a basic level, think about all the school budgets around this country. every single year that get voted down?
Yeah. Well, I think, it's a couple of things. I think one is we still have a hard time caring about other people's children in the way that we care about our own. And so there is this dynamic where folks, understandably, are worried about their kid's situation, and it doesn't feel as immediate that the kid down the road doesn't have access to the internet. It doesn't feel as immediate that the school in the next community over doesn't offer advanced placement courses. It doesn't feel pressing that some kids don't think college is possible for them. So it's really, I think, a question of empathy. Can we empathize with other people's situation? And the other is we just haven't, as a country, been willing to invest the level of resources in education that I think is foundational to democracy. If healthy, well-functioning democracy, we need informed voters, we need informed jurors, we need informed civic participation, and that requires investment at every level, early childhood, K-12, higher education.
Then before we get into the data and what you really know about what this country looks like, tell me about, how did you feel personally March, April, May, when schools were shutting down? You, as someone who just said you were a public school kid in New York City, where schools saved your life. Knowing what you know, how did you feel thinking about all of those kids just like you who were home, who didn't have that life-saving school, who might not have it this fall?
Scared, honestly, scared for kids who are in situations where they feel so alone and isolated. And, you think about the kids who are in homes where their family was affected by the health trauma inflicted by COVID-19, the economic trauma inflicted by COVID-19, but also about kids who are in homes where there's abuse, where there's addiction, where there's domestic violence. And for me, the ability to have these relationships with adults and peers outside of school was essential. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to go months without that opportunity to be a kid. School was the place where I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. And so I think I feel this great fear, and I fear that for kids going into this next school year, because we are where we are with COVID. There are a lot of schools that aren't going to open, and kids are, again, going to be home, isolated, without those connections and relationships.
Then how do you feel, right? I mean, right now there's for some reason, as complicated a situation as this is, we're seeing this very black and white response of school must open no matter what, kids need to be going to school. And then the opposite response of, while the health risk remains, we absolutely can't. Where do you come out on it?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I go back and forth between angry and heartbroken, right? Because, so I did an event a few weeks ago with the Minister of Education of Finland. Finland already, Finland, the education minister of Finland, they opened their schools already. They had 2 weeks of school before the summer break, but it's because they have the pandemic under control. So we're in this debate as a country, open schools, don't open schools, ignoring that if we don't get control of the pandemic, we can't have a rational conversation about school reopening. When you have cases escalating the way they are, because we don't have the things that our international peers have. We don't have testing and contact tracing and a thoughtful strategy to help people quarantine. We haven't invested in the public health work that is necessary to make it possible for schools to open safely. And then we haven't invested the resources in schools. I mean, we have schools where you go in the bathroom, there's no soap. And we know hand washing has got to be a part of the public health approach. We have classrooms that are incredibly crowded. How are students going to be 6 feet apart? So we have to invest resources in schools to make it possible for schools to open safely. So it's, again, we haven't made the choice as a society to do the things necessary on behalf of all kids to make school possible.
Does it ever feel, though, we often refer to countries like Look what they're doing in Finland. Look what they're doing in Norway. Check out Sweden. We often choose countries like this and mark them against the United States on a myriad of issues. But these are countries that are the size of the state of New York or smaller. Given the size of the United States of America, do we have to address education, especially as it relates to low income kids, kids of color who are disadvantaged? Do we need to approach this on a state and local level, not on a federal level?
Well, we need federal leadership. Ultimately, education is a state and local responsibility, but we need federal leadership, and we particularly need federal leadership where education and public health intersect, right? Because, New York has done a good job on getting COVID under control, and Florida has done a terrible job. And at the end of the day, people from Florida are going to come to New York. And so we can't have just a state-by-state strategy on addressing COVID, which means we can't ultimately keep our schools safe because schools aren't in a bubble. They're interacting with the rest of society. So we need a national strategy on COVID. On education, we need federal leadership to say, here are what best practices are. Here's what civil rights protection requires. And we need federal resources to try to level out some of the gaps that we see at the local and state level.
The teachers union thinks it's going to cost $116 billion to reconfigure schools to safely reopen. And thus far, the federal government has allotted $13 billion. We anecdotally talk about what it's like for kids, but tell us, what are you seeing for kids right now, K through 12, kids in college? What is it like?
Yeah. Well, there's been a lot of learning lost. And it varies. Look, there are places where there are some affluent communities where the transition was very smooth, where teachers were already using technology tools. Kids were working from home. They missed out on the social experiences, but it was a relatively smooth transition. There are other schools where kids weren't able to log in. We know, for example, 79% of white families have reliable internet access. 66% of African-American families, 61% of Latino families. If you can't get on the internet, you can't go to school. And so we had kids throughout the spring who weren't even able to log in for their classes. We had school districts that were under-resourced trying to put together distance learning overnight. And as a result, the quality was very uneven of kids' experience. Kids were without all the things that for many kids make school the place they want to be. They were without sports, without extracurriculars, without music, without the arts, without their opportunity to see the counselor, without their opportunity to interact with their mentors at school. And so we know there's a lot of learning loss. McKinsey just did a study showing that on average, there'll be 7 months of learning loss. For Latino students, 9 months. For African-American students, 10 months. We know that there are high school students who probably won't come back. And so we will see, after a decade of progress on graduation rates, we're likely to see a drop off as some students don't return to school. And we saw similar struggles in higher ed. Students who had to go home, who didn't have really homes to go to. Students who were struggling to keep up with their online work and then lost their job. Because of the COVID-19 financial crisis. And now we're seeing the consequences of cuts. So, CUNY, for example, in New York City is facing huge cuts because state and local budgets have taken a big hit from the COVID-19 economic crisis.
It didn't just end with the school year. When you talk about kids losing their jobs, they don't have summer programs, they don't have summer school. Many don't have summer jobs, and they don't have parents who can give them money. Does it concern you that so many kids are going to lose their focus, lose their way? Besides just a loss of learning in terms of, I didn't learn trigonometry this year, they're going to lose their center, which is that thing that drives you forward.
That's right. Their sense of hope and purpose. I mean, think about the rates of child hunger that we're seeing because of the COVID economic crisis and kids not being in school, which is where 20 million plus kids rely on schools to provide their meals. So if you're hungry, you can't think about anything else, right? And so you think about kids who are facing hunger, they're seeing their families lose jobs, they're seeing their families' health negatively impacted, and their sense of hope about the future is being undermined. And, we have a responsibility if we want a healthy society to address that. We have a responsibility through philanthropy and through government to try to address that.
What about through business? When I hear you talk about communities that don't have access to Wi-Fi and there's kids who can't log on, I keep thinking, we've got the world's most successful technology companies. We've got American trillionaires in the world of technology. And while it's not their legal responsibility, isn't there a very clear opening right now for many businesses to step in and say, we can cut through red tape. We're not government on the right side or the left side of the aisle. We can solve for this.
Oh, absolutely. But you have to have a vision. I know this is something you care a lot about. You have to have a vision of businesses as part of the community and having a community responsibility. That part of the bottom line is not only financial profit for the shareholders, but community good. And if that is true, then yes, you should, if you're a tech company, be trying to address the internet gaps. You should, if you're a company that produces materials that could be used for testing or for personal protective equipment, you should be providing that. And you should be doing that because you understand that the good of your business is tied up with the overall good of society. I worry that not everyone feels that way.
But then shouldn't we start looking at it not as philanthropy, but as a business imperative, right? If I'm a business leader or if I'm a government leader, the best chance for me to succeed is to lead in a society that's thriving, not one that's suffering.
Oh, no question about that. No question about that. But you have to have a long-term view, right? It means that you're willing to trade maybe a bit of your profit margin today for what things will look like 10 years out, 20 years out. But we have a real risk of losing a generation of kids. The combination of the COVID-19 crisis, school closures, and the COVID-19 economic crisis could cost us a generation of kids who are persistently behind and despairing about the American dream.
Have you ever seen a crisis like that, with all that you're saying is at risk right now? Have you ever seen a crisis greater than this in your life?
No. I mean, I think this is our biggest crisis as a country since the Great Depression. Not only economically, but the sort of well-being of our democracy.
Then here we are in an absolute state of crisis. Take us from we should do this, we need a grand plan, because those things are amazing, but they're really, you can't touch them, right? We're in an emergency, we're in a crisis right now. For people that are listening, who are watching, who are saying, I want to be a change agent, what's the thing that we can start to do and change and demand today?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you three examples that obviously we're thinking a lot about at Robinhood. One is people have to have food and they have to have a roof over their heads. And so addressing hunger and the potential that many, many families will be evicted over the next few weeks and months, that has to be first. You think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We can't get into other issues until we've made sure that people have food and a roof over their heads. So that's one. Two, we know that in New York, there's a large immigrant population, folks who are undocumented. And as a result of bad public policy decisions, undocumented folks get almost no support from the federal or state government. And so we've got to step in. There are families, literally, they can't access food stamps. They can't access housing vouchers. They can't access the unemployment benefits. And so we've got to step in for those folks. We are better as a society than letting people starve or die on the street. And that is where we are.
What is the rationale? right? As somebody who influences policy, what is the rationale right now in not providing a broader net of support, right? Even if you had a hardline view on immigration, okay? We have 11 million undocumented immigrants that live in the United States. We know that COVID, a great chance of COVID spreading is through community spread. And if you have 11 million people who do not have access to any of those government programs and there's no jobs for them to get, then they can put millions of other people at risk. What's the rationale behind not doing more?
Yeah. Well, I think people have deluded themselves to think if we provide no benefits, then folks will somehow go away or disappear. And that is not rational. The folks who are here are staying here. They will be here. And so the question is, what kind of society do we want to have? And if you believe in the dignity of our fellow human beings, then you have to believe that we should do more to support folks. And in many cases, as you know, these are folks who are critical to our economy. They're playing crucial roles in our economy. There are many undocumented folks who are working in our hospitals and nursing homes and playing critical roles as essential workers. So it's in our interest to make sure that people have food, have housing, have access to emergency health care so that they're able to be able to function in our society.
They came to the United States because there were jobs here. There was demand, and somehow we tend to forget that. What is it like right now? What can people do? You mentioned you started, actually I cut you off. You started with food insecurity. You said you had a couple more.
Yeah. So food and housing, undocumented folks, and then I would say this question of how are we going to build back? And this is why I'm obviously so focused on education, both K-12 and higher ed, as well as job training. If we want to have a more equitable economic recovery, we have to help people get access to skills and opportunity. And that comes through our schools and through our higher ed institutions. So I think about, there's a program, for example, that Robinhood has supported called ASAP. It's a program at CUNY that helps community college students to get to graduation. CUNY ASAP has been shown in randomized controlled trials to double the community college completion rate. That is the kind of program that is going to be eliminated because of funding cuts. That is very short-sighted, but I think there's a need for philanthropy to step in and say, we're going to protect these programs that we know are vital paths to opportunity.
But then do we need to start reconfiguring how we look at philanthropy, right? You're talking about a vital program that will have a huge impact on communities, on society getting cut, and our Ivy League colleges have larger endowments than they've ever had in their university histories. That can't just be about, I really want to get my son who's kind of a B- into Harvard. Wouldn't you think that the most successful people in this country have a broader view of who and what we are and where they want their kids to be living?
I would hope so. And look, I love my alma mater just as much as the next person, but I also think when we're thinking about our charitable giving, we should be thinking about what are the institutions that are engines of social mobility. And community colleges, regional public colleges, they serve the lion's share of students who are in college, and they have for generations been the engine of social mobility. My mother was born in Ponce, in Puerto Rico. She came to New York when she was 5 or 6 years old. She learned English in New York City public schools. She went to Hunter, part of the CUNY college system. She went to Hunter and she became a teacher, right? That's the American dream. My grandmother didn't go to college. Her daughter got to go to college because of Hunter, because of the CUNY system. That's what we need. We need to invest in the American dream, and that means investing in those higher ed institutions that serve large numbers of low-income students. Harvard will be fine.
But then, and I know then is part of the answer that maybe there are too many options when it comes to education. Think about the last 30 years, all of the small private colleges that have opened that cost 40, 50, 60, $70,000. So they've popped up everywhere, and you've got these public institutions that, if they were stronger, if they had more funding, could serve so many more. And couple that with the trillions of dollars of student debt many Americans have, there's a mismatch.
Yeah, I mean, 75% of college students are in public colleges, right? Those are the institutions on which our democracy depends. And so we have to invest in them. We have to invest public resources in them, but also private resources. When businesses are thinking about job training programs, they should be thinking about partnering with CUNY and SUNY and our public higher ed system. Right? When they're thinking about where are the places I want to invest research dollars, they should be thinking about those public institutions.
Can we retrain our businesses to think that way? Think about.
I think so. I hope so. You know, there's a program that IBM has called PTech. It's a partnership between IBM, City University of New York, and New York City DOE. When kids graduate from PTech, they graduate with a high school diploma, associate's degree, first in line for a job at IBM. And when I was working in New York State government, when I was commissioner in New York, we worked with the governor to replicate that program around the state. There are now, I think, 15, 20, maybe more PTech schools all around the state partnering with CUNY and SUNY. And those PTech programs are a pathway to opportunity. They're life-changing. I remember sitting with kids at the Brooklyn PTech school, and a kid said to me, I love this school because I know I want to be an engineer, and I know I want the car that my IBM mentor drives. And I thought, that's great. Like, he has such a clear vision of what he wants his life to be like, and that would not have been possible but for that partnership between IBM, CUNY, and New York City DOE.
When I think about the Robin Hood community or the Robin Hood audience, when we have lots of conversations, they're often focused on philanthropic giving. But a lot of people in the Robin Hood community also have a lot of influence. They have a lot of influence over policymakers. When you think about policies that people of influence should be focused on, demanding of their lawmakers, what should we be thinking about?
Oh, I mean, the list is so long, but I'll give you.
The list is so long and the problems are so big, then it gets, oh, I'm confused, and it pushes us aside.
That's right.
So I want you to give us home. We're talking education.
Yeah. So I'll give you two. In higher ed, Pell Grants are the main form of aid for low-income students to go to college. In 1980, Pell Grants accounted for about 80% of the cost of a public four-year college degree. Today, Pell Grants account for about 28% of the cost of a public four-year college. That means students are borrowing more. It means students are having a harder time finishing. It means students are making the trade-off between tuition and eating, tuition and housing. There was a bill in the California legislature last year to allow students to park overnight in the parking lots of their community colleges because they knew they had a lot of community college students who were homeless. And the idea was if they could park in the parking lots, that would be better than them having nowhere to go.
How did we get here, John? How did we get here that we're changing policy so to help students who are homeless sleep in their cars?
I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. And we, in the wealthiest country in the world, we can do better, right? So just, if we doubled Pell Grants, that would be life-changing for a generation, for generations to come, really. It would change the trajectory of many young people, allowing them to finish college. So that's like one simple higher ed thing. In K through 12, there's so many interconnected challenges. But I would say there was one thing we should be focused on. It's reading. It's making sure that students get a good foundation in reading. And as a country, we have not been willing to do that. We have not been willing to make sure that that kids can get early childhood education. We've not been willing to make sure that our teachers are well trained in teaching reading. If you are not reading by the time you are in third grade, if you are not a strong reader, we can see in the data, your chances of graduating from high school go down and your chances of being incarcerated go up. There's one thing I would bet on in K-12, it is early reading instruction.
Given that and how many challenges we know students have, how concerned are you that this pandemic has made things even worse for those who have any sort of challenges or special needs around basic things like reading?
Oh, it's definitely made it worse. I mean, you think about, school is where most kids, not all kids, but most kids learn to read. So you think about a kid who missed first grade, who missed 3-4 months of first grade last year. Now, in affluent families, maybe parents were able to make up for it. Maybe they were able to work from home. But a lot of folks can't work from home. Only about 1 in 5 African Americans in the workforce can work from home. Only 1 in 6 Latinos can work from home. So that first grader now didn't spend time reading. Now they're supposed to come back to second grade. Not clear they're ready to do second grade work, but that's their age. They're going to go to second grade, but now second grade is going to start hybrid, maybe. And so they'll be in class a couple of days. And now the teacher's task is to make up for what they missed half of first grade and also keep them moving in second grade. It's a huge problem. If there's one other public policy thing I could add in, there's a proposal to grow the AmeriCorps program, which allows young people to earn money that they can use for college, either in between high school and college or straight out of college, doing national service. That program ought to double, triple in size, and we ought to have many, many more young people who are coming out of college trained to be tutors and mentors to help make up for the ground that kids have lost. I think that would make us a stronger society as well, if we have that common national service experience.
Do you think what we are all, because one thing, and while the loss varies, obviously, collectively as a society, as a country, we've all experienced some level of loss because of COVID. Do you think this pandemic has heightened the need or the push for a year of national service, right? We talked about it in the abstract. And some people, I shouldn't say the abstract. There's a lot of people who did talk about it before, but do you see more groundswell or support of something like a year of national service now, given the deficit in education?
I do. Senator Coons from Delaware has a bill to double the size of AmeriCorps. It has good bipartisan support. There are not a lot of things in this moment that have strong bipartisan support. That bill does, because I think there's a realization across the political spectrum and across the regional spectrum that we have these huge needs as a result of the impact of COVID. I also think you see in the movement of young people around Black Lives Matter, when I went with my family to the protests, one of the things that was so striking to me was the incredible diversity of the young people. That wasn't just African American young people who were out protesting. It was Black young people with white young people, with Latino young people. It was LGBTQ young people who all of whom are seeing the interconnectedness between our systems in America and the work we need to do to get better. So that was really encouraging to me. I think that energy is something powerful that we could tap into through national service. I think that has also heightened people's attention to what's possible.
Then given that we've got tens of thousands of kids graduating high school who are now questioning, am I going to start my freshman year of college? A, given the cost, or B, that college won't be that experience, or millions of kids getting out of college who don't have great job opportunities. Is this a moment where we can create a national jobs program right now that's actually focused on K through 12 education and use so many of those young people who don't have the job or higher education opportunities, but they've got the desire to make the world better and smarter?
Yes, I think so. I think about City Year and the way that City Year could absorb so many of those young people and put them right
That
to
is.
work in school. So City Year is a program that was actually started decades ago as a national service program. They essentially create these teams of young people who either just graduated from high school or just graduated from college, and they're placed in teams in schools or in community centers or in YMCA's, and they run after school programs. They do during the day tutoring for students, and their spirit is that they're really trying to not just serve the students, but they're trying to give their core members the opportunity to grow as people. And so you might have someone who just graduated from, an elite college like Williams. They're volunteering next to someone who just graduated from a high school in a really challenged neighborhood of Boston and has never been exposed to the kinds of experiences that their fellow core member would have at Williams. And they're learning from each other. And there's something to me that's really powerful about that kind of cross-class, cross-cultural learning that can take place.
Couldn't that education and empathy have a significant impact on the way we lead our country in generations forward?
I think so. I think that's part of the story of the greatest generation, right? That folks who served in World War II, because World War II affected so much of the country, and you had people having the experience of serving next to people who were so different from them. They came back with a common sense of American identity. There's something about national service that could give us that spirit.
People might want to write to Chris Coons tomorrow and say, I want to get behind this because it would address so many issues right now. As a dad, I have to ask you, you have to be looking at education through also a different personal lens. How do you see it for your own son?
Yeah.
September is less than 2 months away.
Yeah. So I have two daughters who are 14 and 16. One of them will be a freshman and one of them will be a senior. My kids go to Montgomery County Public Schools here in Montgomery County, Maryland. And
they're not going, right?
No, they're going to start virtual. And, look, I have a lot of privilege. My girls have a lot of privilege. We have many blessings. And I am sad about their experience. I mean, my older daughter, who's going to be a senior, she's not going to have a normal senior year. She loves theater. She's not going to get to have a fall play, and I worry if there'll be a spring play. My younger daughter would be a freshman. She's going to start her freshman year of high school classes online, not having met the teachers or her peers in person. And so I'm sad for them, and I'm worried because if the country doesn't get our act together around COVID, it's not just that they're going to start online. I think there's a chance they may spend the whole school year online if we don't figure out as a country how we get control of the pandemic.
That actually takes us to a viewer question that almost seems so fitting. Then do you think education has been permanently changed by the pandemic?
Yes, in two ways. One is I think it has brought attention to gaps in a way that has heightened our understanding of what needs to happen. So the optimistic side of me believes that we now understand that the homework gap, which is what we used to call the digital divide, has to be closed. That in the 21st century, to have access to educational opportunity, you have to have access to the internet. So one, I'd like to think that this moment has forced a set of conversations that are truly different about equity. Two, I do think that the online learning, I wouldn't call this a silver lining, but I would say one hopeful thing is that, and I've seen this with my own daughters, learning online means that you're doing some of the work much more independently than you would have before. And so you have to learn how to set goals, manage your time, ask questions when you need help, act on feedback. It's created more student agency. And I think that's going to have kids come back to bricks and mortar school looking for more control of their own learning and more control over their own work. And that's probably a good thing. That's an improvement.
I'm hesitant to call this a silver lining, but is there a silver lining also in that when you were talking about your daughters and your family, how blessed your family is, everyone has experienced loss. Has this experience possibly created so much more attention that we are going to create a more significant change, right? The inequalities we were seeing, specifically in education, were like slow bleeding to death. Well, now we're gushing blood. And could there actually be, do you see some level of hope that maybe, just maybe, given how bad things are, they could end up better? Or am I just...
Yes, no, I think that's right. I think about like early childhood education. I mean, I'm sure you have this experience as I do with some colleagues. I have colleagues who they've always in their family had childcare, right? Like childcare was a given. And now they've had the experience of what it is like to try to work when you have no childcare. And a lot of friends who have kids in the 0 to 4 range who are exhausted, right? And so there's a awareness of the stakes of childcare that is different. And I'd like to think that then when policymakers say, should we have universal access to childcare 0 to 4? There are some folks who maybe before wouldn't have seen why that's so urgent who will say now, yep, we ought to do that. That's an investment worth making. I hope that's the case.
See, I think as it relates to childcare, maybe we're finally realizing that childcare isn't for children ages 0 to 4. And children need to be cared for all through grade school. This whole idea that, oh, we now have maternity leave and paternity leave, we're all set, or we're doing something for kids 0 to 4. You got kids until they go to college. And there are thousands of kids right now who are home with working parents, 6 and 7-year-olds. Parents can't go back to work if they have young children at home.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. And again, we're in this situation. I do want to say, like, this is not just an education problem. This is a societal problem. We didn't do the things around COVID that we needed to do to make it possible for schools to be back in operation. We made choices as a society, and we are now dealing with the consequences of those choices. We don't have testing, we don't have contact tracing, we have places that open too fast, we have places that prioritize bars over schools, and so here we are.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at NFL stadiums that are completely kitted out, ready, preparing themselves to have fans come back, and we're not doing that in our schools yet.
Yeah.
How do we, is the only way we can address that through banging on doors politically, or can philanthropy make a difference? Because in some ways, this feels bigger than philanthropy. In many ways, it feels bigger than philanthropy. I mean, philanthropy can't solve the New York City public school system as it relates to COVID safety.
No, I think, and this is one of the reasons why I always try to argue that philanthropy has to include advocacy. There are some people who say, well, we should only do philanthropy.
I think people don't make that, Derek Kaufman on the Robin Hood board talks about this all the time, but he's sort of in the minority. So can you help us understand what that means?
Yeah. So, a lot of philanthropy is focused on direct service. And I believe in that, and that's hugely important. We have to get food to folks. We have to help people pay their rent. We have to help provide programs that help folks who are returning from incarceration get good jobs. We should definitely fund all of those direct service activities. And the public sector has billions and billions and billions of dollars, and all the philanthropy added together in this country still would be dwarfed by the public spending. And so we have got to invest in advocacy where organizations are making the case, hey, when you create this new program to address hunger as a result of COVID, you really do need to include undocumented families. And convincing the legislature and the Congress to do the right thing, which then opens up public dollars, which is going to provide a lot more support to a lot more families. And I think sometimes people think you either are going to fund direct service or advocacy, and I would say we need to fund both. And there's a nascent policy committee at Robin Hood, and we're starting to think about some strategic advocacy funding. And I think Derek is right about that. That's an important area for us to invest in.
Seeing that public funds dwarf what philanthropy could ever do, is there a place, is there a way people could a place people would go to, or they could start to focus beyond this conversation to say, I do care about education equality, and especially addressing it through COVID, where they can look to say, what are the policies I should be trying to advocate for? Or because I do think a lot of people, especially people of influence, only think, I'm going to focus on raising philanthropic dollars. How do we start to shift if we don't consider ourselves an advocacy wonk? Because very few people are advocacy wonks. How do we get there?
Yeah. Well, so they could go to the EdTrust website, to edtrust.org, and sign up for our newsletter, because we have a newsletter that will help inform people about education and civil rights issues. Marian Wright Edelman is on the Robin Hood board. Children's Defense Fund has been for decades working on these issues, not just in education, but also in access to healthcare and nutrition and so many other issues that are relevant for kids and families. So going to visit the Children's Defense Fund site and signing up for their newsletter, so you have a sense of the issues that they're working on. Those would be two places to start.
People often say, oh, the answer is just go and vote. It can't just be that things shift so dramatically every 4 years or every 8 years. I mean, this has been a slow bleed in terms of inequality over decades. So there's no one president or political party to point to. So on an ongoing basis, for those who are committed to making the world better and smarter, how should they be changing the way we live and what we do?
Yeah. Well, a couple immediate thoughts. One is, the business community can have a lot of influence over the decisions that policymakers make. You think about how cities, when a business says, we may come to your city, we may not. And the city falls all over themselves to offer all kinds of tax benefits and so forth. What if businesses use a little bit of that leverage to say, if we're going to locate in your city, we need to know that you've made changes to your policing policies, so that, because we believe Black Lives Matter, we put a statement out to our employees about it, but actually we're going to make our business decisions on that basis too. We're not going to move to a city that allows the use of chokeholds on folks. We're not going to move our business to a city that won't report the data on police-involved shootings, for example. Or what if a business said, for us to come to your city, we need to know that your public higher ed institution is going to be able to partner with us on programs in high schools, as well as programs on their campus to train our next generation workforce. That matters as much to us as any tax benefit. That'd be pretty powerful.
Then I think I want to make sure I understand this takeaway, because if I do, I think it's an amazing one. So for consumers out there, or for employees or executives of big companies, right? I can't think of a big company today that didn't black out their Instagram page or put out a statement or their new mission statement to say what they stand for. Is this an opportunity right now to say to that business, then show me what you are actually doing? Because the lobbying efforts and the policy influence that big business has, for the most part, they focus it on their own business interests.
100%. That's right. And so to me, the question is, was your statement of solidarity just rhetorical, or was there a substantive commitment behind it? And then if there was a substantive commitment, that needs to be reflected in your advocacy efforts, and it needs to be reflected in your practices. And that's the second piece. So if you're an employer who are your employees? And are you committed to racial diversity amongst your employees? Are you committed to creating access to opportunity for low-income folks to have access to good jobs? Like, how serious is your conviction about this? Are you committed as an alum of an institution to find out how many Pell eligible students did the college I went to admit last year? And why isn't that number higher? How many Black students? How many Latino students? Why aren't those numbers higher? And when you're deciding about writing that check to your alma mater, or when you're sitting with a college president at that alumni fundraising dinner, are you asking those questions and pushing them? So it's sort of this question, and I think about this a lot in terms of John Lewis, whose life we're celebrating this week as he has passed on. You know, one of the things I admired most about him was living his principles, living his values, being willing to stand on that Edmund Pettus Bridge and risk his life for belief in democracy, and that voting is essential to democracy, and that you shouldn't be denied the right to vote because of your race. But then also living his values in forgiving the person who beat him on the bridge. Right? Like, he every day tried to figure out, if I believe in the beloved community, what does that mean about the choices I make? And so I think for all of us, you know, his life stands as a challenge to all of us. Like, how do we live our values? And if we believe them with our philanthropy, we should believe them with our policy advocacy. We should believe them with our interaction with our alma mater. We should live those values in every place we can.
Then do you feel that weight and that responsibility at a time like this, when we lose leaders like John Lewis and Elijah Cummings? There's a risk that who's the next one? Or maybe there'll never be someone like them, but there has to be a piece of them in all of us who consider ourselves advocates.
Yes, I have to believe that, right? To say hopeful that, and you know, John Lewis's last public event was to go to the Black Lives Matter protests in DC, and to stand with young people who are carrying on the tradition of peaceful protests to achieve a more just society. And so I feel a responsibility to try to carry out that legacy in whatever small way that I can in my day. And I hope each of us will.
You have felt this responsibility for years, though, right? Like, so much of this is your life's work. For those who have become inspired and engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement, and you mentioned it before, this is sort of the first time we've seen people outside the African American community stand up and say, we want the world to be different. Do you think there is a prescription to help people figure out, well, you may not be protesting anymore, but how are you going to use this? And do you think there's enough information out there to help people understand, how do I keep this going? What do I do to keep pushing forward? I mean, this idea, ask your business leaders, right? If the Business Roundtable wants a round of applause and a whole lot of press for signing a letter, and every chance you have to be around the CEO of one of those companies, are you saying, great, you signed that letter, what are you going to do now?
That's right. That's right. And it's asking that at the school board meeting, and it's asking that at the foundation board meeting, right? So Robinhood, for example, you know, we in this moment looking at this national reckoning around issues of racial justice, looked at our portfolio and said, we do not have enough organizations that are led by people of color. So Robinhood is launching a power fund in order to make sure that we have identified great leaders of color who are leading impactful organizations that are producing social mobility in New York City, and that we're investing in them. And it's a strategy both to make an investment in this moment, but also to ultimately change the whole portfolio, to say we've got to have a portfolio that is representative the diversity of our city. And I'm proud that we're doing that. I'm proud that the Robin Hood Board committed to that. And we just got to ask. We got to ask at the church board meeting. We got to ask it at our PTA meeting. We just got to keep holding up the mirror to ourselves and saying, how do we turn these pledges of being better into the action of doing better?
We got to do what John Lewis told us to do all these years, John. Make some good trouble. John, I'm afraid we have lost your sound. I thought it was just me, but our audience can't hear you either.
No. Can you hear me now?
You kind of sound like Darth Vader, and that's a bad look for you, given all the significant things that you're saying. The fact that you sound like Darth Vader as you're telling it to me is a problem. However, we are about out of time, so we're going to wrap this up. John, I just want to say thank you for all your work. Thank you for sharing your time tonight and giving us a little bit of your magic. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for the conversation.
All right. And to Robin Hood, as always, thank you. And thanks for everybody listening and watching. Thank you for being Robin Hoods. Good night, everybody.